Have you ever stopped to think that Voldemort's most loyal creature, that giant serpent who terrorized the wizarding world, was once a woman? A woman with dreams, fears, and an entire life ahead of her? Nagini wasn't born a monster. She was born human, with warm blood running through her veins, with real tears falling from her eyes, and with a heart that beat to the rhythm of hopes that would never come true. This is the story that time itself tried to erase, the forgotten tragedy of a young woman who lost everything, including her own humanity. But before we dive into this painful and revealing journey, I need your support. If you're curious to discover the darkest secrets of the Harry Potter universe, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any exclusive content. And tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this video? I want to know where the true fans are who aren't afraid to explore the most obscure corners of magic. Now prepare yourself, because Nagini's story begins long before Harry Potter was born, long before Voldemort became the most feared dark wizard of all time. It begins in a place where magic mixed with despair, where traveling circuses promised wonders but hid misery, and where a young woman fought against a destiny that was already written in her own blood. Nagini was born in the early 20th century, somewhere in Southeast Asia, probably in Indonesia. She wasn't an ordinary witch. Nagini was a maledictus, a woman who carried a blood curse transmitted exclusively through the maternal line. This curse wasn't like the others we know in the wizarding world. It wasn't something that could be broken with a powerful spell or cured with an elaborate potion. It was something engraved in magical DNA, a death sentence of identity that passed from mother to daughter through generations. The maledictus curse worked in a cruel and progressive way. Nagini had the ability to transform into a serpent at will, but each transformation brought her closer to a point of no return. As the years and transformations passed, she would gradually lose the ability to return to human form until one day, inevitably, she would be trapped forever in the form of a snake. Imagine carrying that weight. Imagine knowing that each time you used your own power, you would be walking one more step toward forgetting yourself. Her mother, who was also a maledictus, probably went through the same agony. Perhaps Nagini watched her own mother lose her humanity, permanently transforming into a serpent before her eyes. Or perhaps her mother disappeared before that, leaving only warnings and tears for a daughter who would inherit the same dark fate. We don't know the details of this part of her story, but we know that Nagini grew up conscious of the curse running through her veins, counting the days of her humanity like someone counting grains of sand slipping through their fingers. In the 1920s, Nagini was in Paris. The City of Light, as it was known, was a center of magical activity at the time, attracting wizards and creatures from all corners of the world. But Nagini wasn't there as a tourist or student. She was there as property. She had become part of a circus, the Circus Arcanus, a traveling attraction that exploited magical creatures and different beings for the entertainment of audiences who paid to see the extraordinary. Circus Arcanus was run by Skender, a cruel man who didn't see his attractions as sentient beings, but as commodities. Nagini was kept in a cage when she wasn't performing, treated like an exotic animal, not like the woman she was. During performances, she was forced to transform into a serpent before crowds that applauded and screamed, unaware of the price each transformation took from her. Each show was a piece of her humanity being torn away. Each applause was a nail being hammered into the coffin of her identity. The humiliation was constant. She wore clothes that looked more like costumes, covered with scales and serpent adornments, as if she were a themed object and not a person. Her name was announced with fanfare, her curse was sold as entertainment, and her dignity was trampled night after night under the circus lights. But behind those eyes that the audience saw as exotic and mysterious, there was a woman imprisoned not only by the physical bars of the cage, but by the invisible chains of a curse she didn't choose to carry. It was during this dark period of her life that Nagini met Credence Barebone. Credence was a tormented young man, an obscurial who carried within him a destructive force born from years of abuse and magical repression. He was also part of the circus, another lost soul exploited by Skender. But between these two imprisoned souls, something true blossomed, a genuine connection, a mutual understanding that can only exist between those who know the deep pain of not belonging anywhere. Nagini and Credence formed a bond that went beyond common friendship. They were soulmates in suffering, two people who carried curses in their bodies and who understood the loneliness of being different in a way that no one else could comprehend. Nagini saw in Credence someone who was also losing himself, just like her. She saw the Obscurus consuming him slowly, the same way her curse consumed her. And in this mutual recognition of pain, something precious was born: hope. Nagini became Credence's anchor, the only person who could calm him when the Obscurus threatened to explode. She spoke to him in a low voice, touched his face with hands that were still human, and reminded him that he wasn't alone. For Credence, Nagini was proof that there was still goodness in the world, that there was still someone who saw him as a person and not as a monster. For Nagini, Credence was the last connection to her humanity, the only reason to keep fighting against the inevitable transformation. When the opportunity arose, they fled together from Circus Arcanus. It was an act of desperate courage, two prisoners breaking their chains and running toward a freedom they barely knew how to experience. Paris, in the 1920s, was a labyrinth of dark alleys and magical secrets, and they hid in the shadows, trying to build some semblance of normal life while greater forces conspired around them. It was during this period of escape that they became involved in the turbulent events related to Gellert Grindelwald. The dark wizard was on the rise, preaching a new world order where wizards would rule muggles, where secrecy would be broken and magical power would be supreme. His words were seductive, especially for those who had been marginalized, exploited, and treated as less than human. For people like Nagini and Credence, who knew the dark side of society, the promise of a different world had powerful appeal. Grindelwald was a masterful manipulator. He didn't just sell ideology, he sold belonging. He offered family to the lonely, purpose to the lost, power to the powerless. And when he fixed his eyes on Credence, recognizing the immense power of the Obscurial, he also recognized that Nagini was the key to controlling him. Grindelwald didn't care about the love between them, but he knew how to use it. Credence, desperate for answers about his true identity and his place in the world, was attracted by Grindelwald's promise to reveal who he really was. And Nagini, despite her instincts screaming that something was wrong, followed Credence because she couldn't abandon him. She loved him in a way that transcended logic, in a way that only someone who is losing everything can love, totally, desperately, without reservations. But the truth about Grindelwald was darker than either of them imagined. He didn't care about Credence as a person, only as a weapon. He didn't see Nagini as a woman, only as a tool to control his Obscurial. When Credence finally began to understand that he was being manipulated, when the rage and pain inside him began to grow uncontrollably, Nagini tried to reach him, tried to bring him back from the edge of the abyss. But it was too late. Credence was consumed by the need for revenge, by the pain of a lifetime of rejection and abuse. And Nagini, watching the man she loved transform into something she no longer recognized, felt her own heart break. She was losing Credence the same way she was losing herself, gradually, inevitably, unable to do anything to stop it. Credence's fate remains shrouded in mystery after the events of 1927. We know he didn't live to see Grindelwald's defeat in 1945, which means he probably died young, consumed by the Obscurus or by the consequences of his actions. And when Credence died, Nagini lost her last anchor to humanity. The person who gave meaning to her struggle, the person for whom she resisted transformation, was dead. Imagine the pain. Imagine being so close to losing your own identity and then losing the only person who made you want to remain human. What was left for Nagini? Where could she go? She was a fugitive maledictus, without family, without home, without future. Each transformation into a serpent now brought her closer to an oblivion she perhaps no longer wanted to resist. The following years are a void in history. We don't know exactly when Nagini permanently lost her human form, but we know it happened. Perhaps it was in the 1930s. Perhaps it was in the 1940s. Maybe she fought until the last moment, transforming less and less frequently, trying to preserve the last vestiges of who she was. Or perhaps, in the absence of any reason to remain human, she surrendered to transformation, letting the serpent swallow the woman once and for all. When the final transformation happened, Nagini didn't die, but the woman she was ceased to exist. Her human memories probably persisted for a while, like ghosts haunting a mind that was becoming increasingly reptilian. Did she remember Credence? Did she remember Paris? Did she remember her own name when it was still spoken with love and not with fear? Eventually, Nagini emerged not as the young woman from the circus, but as a large and powerful serpent. And it was in this form that she crossed paths with Tom Riddle, who would later become Lord Voldemort. The meeting between them wasn't accidental. Voldemort had an affinity with serpents, being a parselmouth, someone capable of speaking the language of snakes. But there was something more in Nagini. She was special, different from other serpents because she had been human. Voldemort recognized this in her, even if unconsciously. He felt the ancient magic that ran through her veins, the curse that had transformed her, and for a wizard obsessed with immortality and power, Nagini represented something fascinating, a being that had transcended humanity, that had become something pure and without human weaknesses. In his twisted mind, Nagini's transformation wasn't a tragedy, it was an evolution. He kept her close, feeding her, speaking to her in Parseltongue, creating a bond that was at the same time genuine connection and cruel manipulation. And when Voldemort began to create his Horcruxes, when he fragmented his soul in search of immortality, he chose Nagini to be more than just a pet. He made her a Horcrux, placing a fragment of his mutilated soul inside the serpent who had once been a woman. This was more than just strategic use of a loyal creature. It was the final desecration of Nagini's humanity. It wasn't enough that she had lost her human form. It wasn't enough that she had been transformed into a serpent by the blood curse. Now she carried within her a piece of the most malignant soul in the wizarding world. The woman who had loved Credence, who had dreamed of freedom, who had fought to maintain her humanity, was now a vessel for a monster's immortality. As a Horcrux, Nagini became even more important to Voldemort. He protected her fiercely, kept her close, trusted her in ways he didn't trust any of his Death Eaters. He sent her on assassination missions, like when she killed Bertha Jorkins in Albania, and later, when she murdered Severus Snape in the Shrieking Shack. The serpent who had been Nagini executed Voldemort's orders without hesitation, without remorse, because what remained of the woman she had been was buried under layers of reptilian instinct and the corrupting influence of Voldemort's soul fragment. But were there moments when some vestige of human memory flickered in the serpent's mind? When Nagini looked at Harry Potter, did she see something familiar in the boy's determination, something that reminded her of another young man who once fought against forces greater than himself? When she witnessed Voldemort's cruelty, did some dormant part of her remember when she herself had been a victim of cruelty? Probably not. The Maledictus curse wasn't just physical. It was a complete erasure. Nagini, the woman, had died long before the serpent was destroyed. And when Neville Longbottom wielded the sword of Gryffindor and beheaded Nagini during the Battle of Hogwarts in 1998, he wasn't just destroying a Horcrux. He was freeing a prisoner who had been trapped for decades, who had been enslaved first by her own curse, then by Voldemort. The sword cut clean, the serpent disintegrated, and with it, the last physical fragment of who Nagini had been disappeared from the world. There was no funeral, no mourning, only relief that another Horcrux had been destroyed, that the path to defeating Voldemort was closer. No one at the Battle of Hogwarts knew they had just killed someone who had once been human, someone who had loved and suffered, someone who had fought against her own destiny until there was nothing left to fight for. Nagini's story is one of the most tragic in the Harry Potter universe because it's a story of complete loss. She lost her family, lost her freedom, lost the man she loved, lost her humanity, and finally lost even her own death, being transformed into a vessel for another's immortality. Each chapter of her life was marked by subtraction, by something being taken from her until nothing remained but a tool in a tyrant's hands. But her story also teaches us something important about the wizarding world. Not all monsters are born monsters. Some are created by curses they didn't choose, by societies that exploit them, by cruel fates written in their blood. Nagini didn't choose to be a maledictus. She didn't choose to be exhibited in a circus. She didn't choose to lose credence. She didn't choose to become a serpent. And she certainly didn't choose to become one of Voldemort's Horcruxes. Her choices were reduced, one after another, until no true choice remained. And in this process, a woman disappeared, and the world remembered her only as Voldemort's Serpent, as a monster that needed to be destroyed. No one in the contemporary wizarding world knew her story. No one knew that the creature slithering through the halls of Malfoy Manor had once walked on two legs, had once loved, had once cried. There's a particular cruelty in being forgotten like this. Nagini was erased twice. First, when the curse transformed her body. Second, when history transformed her memory. She became just another of Voldemort's atrocities, another example of his evil, without recognition that she herself was a victim. Think about the parallels with other characters. Remus Lupin was a werewolf, marked by a curse, but he maintained his humanity, his morality, his ability to choose good, despite the monster within him. Nagini didn't have that choice. Her curse left no room for coexistence between woman and serpent. It was one or the other, and time guaranteed that the serpent would win. Or think about Credence, the man she loved. He carried an obscurus, a destructive force born from trauma. But he had people trying to save him, had Newt Scamander offering help, had Nagini by his side fighting for him. When Nagini died, there was only celebration for the destruction of another Horcrux. The difference wasn't in who they were, but in how the world saw them. Credence was seen as a cursed person. Nagini became seen only as a curse personified, and in that distinction lies all the tragedy of her story. If we look more deeply, Nagini's story also makes us question the nature of identity. At what point did she stop being Nagini, the woman, and become just Nagini, the serpent? When did the last human thought pass through her mind? When did she speak the last words with a human voice? When did she look in the mirror for the last time and see a face she recognized as her own? These questions have no answers because the very process of a maledictus transformation is a gradual disappearance. There's no dramatic moment, no last breath as a human and first hiss as a serpent. It's a sliding, a fading, like a photo left in the sun for too long, until the colors fade completely and only a vague outline of what once was remains. And perhaps the cruelest thing of all is that Nagini probably knew, on some level, what was happening. She watched her mother go through the same process. She knew that each transformation brought her closer to the end. She lived with the awareness of her own imminent extinction for years, perhaps decades. Imagine the psychological weight of that. Imagine knowing you're disappearing, that each day you're a little less yourself, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. This makes the time she spent with Credence even more significant. That was the period when she chose to resist transformation with all her strength, not necessarily for herself, but for him, because he needed her, because she was the only person in the world who understood his pain. And as long as he was alive, as long as he needed her, she would fight to remain human just one more day, just one more hour. There's a dark poetry in the fact that Nagini ended up alongside another man who had lost his humanity. Voldemort had transformed into a monster through his own choices, through murders and soul mutilation. Nagini had transformed into a monster through a curse she didn't choose. But in the end, both were creatures defined by absence. Absence of humanity, absence of love, absence of redemption. The difference is that Voldemort chose each step of his path to monstrosity. Nagini was pushed along hers. Voldemort deserved his fate. Nagini didn't deserve hers, and yet both ended as monsters who needed to be destroyed so the world could be saved. Is there justice in that? Is there equity in Nagini having been killed the same way as any other of Voldemort's Horcruxes, without recognition that she was different, that she had been forced into that role? The answer is probably no. But war is rarely fair. Survival rarely considers nuances, and when Neville raised that sword, he did what needed to be done, not knowing he was ending a story that had begun decades earlier in a circus in Paris. When we think about all of Voldemort's victims, we usually think of people like Lily and James Potter, Cedric Diggory, Sirius Black, people who died fighting against him or for refusing to join him. But Nagini was a victim in a different way. She was a victim who was transformed into a weapon, someone who lost so much that she eventually became part of the problem that needed to be eliminated. It's hard not to feel deep sadness for her. A young woman who just wanted to live her life, who had the capacity to love deeply, who was gentle enough to comfort a tormented obscurial, was transformed by curse, by exploitation, by loss, and finally by the desecration of having a fragment of Voldemort's soul placed inside her, into something unrecognizable. The world doesn't remember Nagini as the brave woman who fled Circus Arcanus. It doesn't remember her as Credence's loyal companion. It remembers her only as Voldemort's Serpent, the Horcrux that was destroyed. And perhaps that's the greatest injustice of all. That after everything she suffered, after being stripped of everything that made her who she was, even her memory was stolen. She didn't receive recognition for having been human, for having fought, for having loved. She's just a footnote in Harry Potter's story, a detail about Voldemort's Horcruxes, without most people knowing that Serpent had a name, had a history, had been someone. But we know now. We know that before being a serpent, Nagini was a woman who was born under a curse, who lived under exploitation, who loved under the shadow of tragic fates, and who lost everything, including herself. Her story is a reminder that in the magical world, as in the Muggle world, there are tragedies that aren't caused by evil, but by cruel circumstances, by ancient curses, by destinies written in blood. Nagini's youth was lost, not in one moment, but in 1,000 small moments. Each transformation, each day in the circus, each time someone looked at her and saw only an attraction, only a serpent, only a creature, never the woman. And finally, when Credence died and took with him her last reason to fight for humanity, Nagini's youth and everything she had been disappeared completely. So when you think about Nagini from now on, don't think only of the giant and terrifying serpent who served Voldemort. Think of the young woman who was exhibited in a circus in Paris. Think of the person who loved so deeply she was able to calm an obscurial. Think of someone who fought against an inevitable curse for as long as she could, until there was nothing left to fight for. This is Nagini's complete story, a story of loss, transformation, and forgetting. A story that reminds us that not all the monsters we see started as monsters, and that sometimes the greatest tragedies are those where there are no clear villains, only victims of circumstances too cruel to bear. Before being a serpent, Nagini was human, and that humanity, though forgotten by the world, deserves to be remembered, deserves to be honored, deserves to have her story told, not as an appendix to Voldemort's story, but as a tragedy in its own right. The tragedy of a life that was slowly stolen, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a creature the world only knew as a monster. This is Nagini's lost youth. Lost not just to her, but to all of us, buried under decades of forgetting, finally revealed, so we can understand that before being Voldemort's most loyal serpent, she was just a woman trying to survive in a world that had no place for her, carrying a curse that guaranteed she would never have the chance to live the life she deserved. And you, what do you think of this story? Can you see Nagini with different eyes now? Has her story changed your perspective on the villains of the Harry Potter universe? Leave your opinion in the comments. I read them all and love to know what you think. If this video touched your heart, if you felt Nagini's tragedy as I felt it while researching and telling this story, leave your like so more people can know the truth about who she really was. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because we have many more forgotten stories and dark secrets of the wizarding world to explore together. Share this video with that Harry Potter fan friend who needs to know this story. Until the next video, and remember, not everything is as it seems in the world of magic.